Questions. Okay. What is important about blank? What's important about blank? What is important? We can always apply to self. In order to learn a little bit about apply to self and the apply to self method, which will actually be an explicit question that comes in down the list a little bit. How do you think about that belief when you apply it to yourself, or what do you think about that belief when you apply it to yourself? Although there's some very good, some really fine little twists and turns we can put on this thing. When do you think about that belief? We're talking about what's implied. There's a lot of things that we can do with implication. There are lots of implied maneuvers we can put in there. When do you think about that belief when you apply it to yourself? Is a little bit sneaky, but it's suggesting that one could, and maybe one privately does apply that belief to oneself. So, if we say we're counseling someone or we're coaching somebody, and they are in a state of perhaps judgment, perhaps great certainty about things. I think you remember that little bit I put of knowing is the enemy of learning. And people do go around in a great deal of certainty about things, and sometimes that certainty, that sort of untested, unchecked certainty, can be a problem. So, if someone has certain very strong judgments, you could say, well, when do you think about that belief when you apply it to yourself? If asked in the right way, at the right time, with the right intention, with the right stress, it can be a very mind-opening, mind-expanding, sometimes mind-blowing type of inquiry. But to back up the list a little bit, what is important about apply that to self? What is important about asking the question, what is important about? What is important about the search for importance? And always remember, if you're your NLP Tai Chi or your NLP Judo is at a high level of training, you can always find these other kind of reversals of perspective, implied reversals of perspective, by asking things like, well, what is unimportant about? What is unimportant about something? So someone is very, very inflamed, or they're very engaged in a problematic way. I don't know, my kid is I don't know, he's got all these strange interests, and he's got these posters of these awful bands he puts up on his wall, and he's got black lights, and he's going off into something that bothers me. He's identifying with a very, very bizarre type of people in our society, and it's driving me out of my mind. You could ask a very interesting question: what is unimportant about that? And because they've got everything framed up as being very, very important and very significant, some figure that they feel a great affinity for, or great identification with, lets them down, or some hero figure they have. People often privately have heroic relationships with figures they identify with, they over-identify with. Lots of over-identifications take place. And if you sense an over-identification or an over-investment in a certain idea or certain thought or a certain figure, you could start asking, well, what's unimportant about that? I don't know who in the world would identify with Ozzy Osbourne, and I assume there are people out there who do identify with Ozzy Osbourne. And if someone's got an issue around that, perhaps they have some version of obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, there are people who genuinely need intervention and need medicine. I mean, their minds get completely fixated on things. So it may be useful to be able to identify when someone is genuinely fixated in a way that's a problem. But you can always test and probe and say, well, they're talking about Oz and their bond with Ozzy, and you're kind of wondering if they're going to maybe start stalking Ozzy or something. So you might just ask and say, well, what is unimportant about Ozzy Osbourne? Tell me everything that's just totally unimportant about this guy, and build a case for his unimportance. I mean, convince me that this is a completely unimportant figure for you, and argue for his unimportance. And that's an interesting task, by the way, sort of an Ericksonian task, is to task someone with making a long, drawn-out, convincing case that something isn't important, that it doesn't matter, why it shouldn't matter. And you may find some lights turning on as to why that is unimportant, why that doesn't matter, why that's insignificant. So what is important about the question, what is important about, is that it can give you a lot of leverage in that person's hierarchy of criteria, which is a very fancy way of saying sort of what turns them on, what gets them going, what warms up their glands. Those are things that are important to them. And you can say, well, let's go into the frame of what's non-important, what's unimportant, what's insignificant, what's ridiculous about something. I think we've probably used up a good chunk of time just on what is important about what's important about. I think what's important about what is important about that question is it lets you kind of rub shoulders with someone's values. It lets you rub shoulders with where their motivational buttons are, and what will press them to action, or what will get them into sort of a decision, wanting to make a decision or wanting to go with something. And you might want to create a little more space in there. You might want to create a little room to undecide, the possibility of undeciding about something. So what is unimportant about what is unimportant? What is a property of what's important about? What's an example of what's important about? What is what's important about an example of? As you can see, we're building quite a nest of possibilities here.